Okay, I think I'll probably get going now. So, hello everyone, and welcome to what is the second webinar in a three-part series focusing on alternative proteins, which we at Table are organising in collaboration with the United Nations Foundation and the UK's Food Systems Agency. Since in the first webinar I gave a very short overview of Table, I'm not going to repeat myself now, but hopefully Jackie will be posting details in the chat. I'm Table's director. So the first in this series focused on investment trends, public attitudes, and the regulatory landscape surrounding alternative proteins. In this second in the series, we're going to be focusing on the health dimensions. And for that, I'm very much delighted to be joined by three great panelists. So Dr. Sarah Najera Espinosa from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, Amy Williams, who's the nutrition lead of the Good Food Institute, and Rob Percival, who's head of policy at the Soil Association. So in this, and all their bios are posted in the chat. So in this second session, we're going to be focusing on what we know about the nutritional dimensions of these foods, and we'll be asking questions about the metrics we use to define their goodness and their badness, how they sit within discussions about ultra-processed foods, and around the sort of wider food system goals around sort of healthy food, healthy planet, and so forth. And in other words, we're going to be exploring how broad our definition of health should go. Once again, we're going to be specifically focusing on the novel end of the alternative protein spectrum, so not on unprocessed beans and pulses, because pretty much everyone agrees that these are good, they should be more part of our diet, and the challenge there is to just get people get more grown, get more eaten. So here we're going to be focusing on precision fermentation and cell-cultivated meat, straying a little bit into the more conventional plant-based alternatives as and when we need to, given that the evidence is still very new and emerging. So we're going to start with three very short presentations from our speakers, and then move on to a panel session, and then finish off with a 30-minute Q&A. And if you have questions for that, please post it in the Q&A section of the Zoom thing rather than in the chat. So yeah, that's it from me for now, and I'm going to hand over now to Sarah, who is going to share her screen. You're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. Can you see the screen well?
Yes.
Perfect. Hello, everyone. So my name is Sarah, as Sarah mentioned, and I work at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine as a research fellow, and I recently completed my PhD on novel plant-based alternatives to meat and dairy. So for this very, very brief talk, I'm just going to tell you a bit of like the takeaways that I have found through these foods, and just sort of like reflect a bit onto like the other novel alternatives. Why is not changing? Okay. So first I wanted to just highlight these and the reason why we're actually discussing plant-based alternatives or other novel alternatives. And I think I wanted to just highlight the urgency of the climate disasters across the world. And here are a few examples of different weather events that we had last year. And the reason why we're thinking and considering shifting meat and dairy is because these foods are emitting a lot of carbon, and these are subsequently also affecting our environment. And these weather patterns are going to get worse and worse. And so therefore we can actually do something with diets. But the real challenge that we're currently having is that dietary change is part of the solution, but is actually going at a very slow pace. So we can see that amongst various people in the world, and within the UK particularly, we see that people are starting to take on plant-based diets, consuming more plant-based alternatives. More people are identifying themselves as reducitarians or flexitarians. But we still see that there is like a large proportion of people that continue eating meat and dairy. And therefore, we need to figure out a way in which these people could actually reduce their consumption, particularly because the majority of people are consuming a lot of animal products that are actually not good for their health. So in terms of the plant-based alternatives, we see that in terms of nutrition composition and health outcomes, when you segregate all the different products, we see that they are quite complex because they vary by primary ingredient, the type of product, and the processing techniques, and of course the brand. And this makes the environment very challenging to actually be able to recommend which is the most adequate product and which one is not. But when we looked at the averages, we do see that there's some certain products that show that they have less saturated fat, less energy density, and a lot more fiber. And when we think about these products, there's this sort of concentration of comparing it to the animal product, and something that we cannot get from animal products is fiber. And this is a component that plant-based alternatives can actually really provide, and we're lacking in our diet. But the biggest discussion, I think, in the field, and I think where most of the challenges we're facing, is that there is this sort of like concentration and obsession over alternative proteins. And the comparison is often the plant-based product versus the meat product or the dairy product, depending on which counterpart we're discussing. And the reality is that we see that consumers are consuming both. Those that are buying plant-based alternatives are consuming animal products, but they're also consuming plant-based alternatives. So we actually need to think of these foods as just a different, an addition to the diet rather than just completely replacing animal products all along. We should also be focusing on those consumers that are following these more flexible diets. And I think when we think of these novel alternatives with the more novel, I guess, culture meat or insects, we already see some highlights of these products being also sort of the promise of the next product. But I think there's a lot of things that we can learn from the plant-based products. So, for example, we really need to consider the behavioral side, and I think we need to consider about the ingredients that these products are made, because, for example, now that everybody's moving into pea protein, this could actually become another challenge if every single other product becomes made of pea protein. And similarly for culture meat, we see that despite the fact that like there is a lot of promises, they rely generally on how they compare to meat, but we really don't even have analytical samples of these products, and this is a big challenge. And also from the consumer perspective, if we have the solution but consumers don't actually consume them, then there's no point of having the solution. So I think this is sort of, in a nutshell, some of the considerations about these products.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'm going to pass over now to Amy from the GFI.
Thank you very much. I'll just share my screen. So hello, everybody. There we go. Okay, so my name is Amy. I am the nutrition lead at the Good Food Institute Europe. And so we work to kind of look at alternative proteins, identify how they can kind of support healthier, more sustainable diets. So I completely agree with everything Sarah has just said, and I think there will be a little bit of overlap in my presentation as well. But I think broadly hoping to add a little bit more about that novel side of things as well in this presentation. So I think the first thing to mention here is that when we talk about what alternative proteins, what would they actually look like in the kind of medium to near to medium term, they're not. I think a lot of people imagine kind of cultivated ribeye steaks and stuff, but that's quite a long way out at this point. A lot of what we're going to be focusing on, I think, is enhanced fermentation techniques to allow more textures and flavors and nutritional profiles from biomass fermentation. So you can see there this picture from Milo, that is mycelium grown through oat. So it's kind of like, you know, tempeh in I think from Indonesia. It's like a from a university in Sweden coming up with a kind of local, more European crop thing, which I think is a really cool example. We also there's so much that we don't yet know about the plant-based crops that we already have. So looking at all of the different breeds of crops that we have across the world and identifying how we can use those to make kind of better ingredients is also a really promising area of research that is a little bit less kind of novel and a bit closer term. We also do have precision fermentation and cultivated meat, which have a lot of promise in the near term to give more flavor, big flavor improvements, and also functionality improvements in these plant-based and fermentation-made foods. So I think, so you can see the example there of the Onego bio, that's egg white made with precision fermentation. So an egg is quite complicated, but that protein with precision fermentation is a little bit more, is still very improved sustainability, but it is a little bit closer to actually being kind of useful. So how can alternative proteins in this context help improve access to healthy and more sustainable diets? So as Sarah just touched on, the available evidence suggests on average, there is a lot of variation, but there is a good nutritional profile in a lot of these foods. And given in the near term, a lot of them will probably, even if they do use precision fermentation and cultivated ingredients, most of the bulk of what you'd be eating would be the plant-based and the fermentation, biomass fermentation side. So that is probably the best indication we have for the health impact. We also know that it's a very big, complicated problem, shifting diets, and there is not going to be one solution. But we do know that so far, plant-based meat alternatives have been popular and have received pretty good uptake in Europe in particular. So they seem like a promising area to start, given how they're usually more expensive and also are a lot newer than kind of other things like tofu, etc. The final consideration is that animal-based foods are not only a significant driver of climate change, but they are also particularly exposed to its effects. So a lot of intake of various nutrients currently are very dependent on animal source foods, and this presents quite a big risk to food security, not just like all over the world, including kind of Western countries and low middle income countries. So I think that's also a consideration that's often maybe missed. These can help meet those needs in more ways, so there's more redundancy and slack in the system if anything does impact productivity. So this is broadly very similar to what Sarah spoke about, but broadly speaking, the nutrient profile of plant-based meat does actually fit quite well with a lot of the needs that we have in terms of how we need to, in the UK at least, kind of improve diet quality. So 81% in the recent National Dietary Survey of people exceeded recommended saturated fat intakes, and 96% of adults did not meet their recommended fiber intakes. So I think that kind of points to the fact that we've had, like, if everybody followed the Eat Well guide, we'd broadly have pretty healthy, sustainable diets, but people are really struggling currently to meet those guidelines. And so this and their popularity so far suggests that it's a kind of promising area by which we can kind of help move towards like a new option to try and support that move towards higher diet qualities. So, and then the final thing I'm just covering off is just some of the key challenges and outstanding questions. So the broader, I know we're going to touch on this, but the broader conversation around ultra processing has given a fairly misleading impression of the health profiles of these foods by and large. So I think that's a big challenge to overcome. We also need more public funding to expand the basic science, improve the taste, quality, affordability of these foods, and explore underutilized crops and strains that we already eat. We also need more public investment in infrastructure and consultation with farmers to make sure that we can have procurement and robust supply chains to make sure that as kind of farmers and growers do want to diversify their farm businesses, they can actually kind of grow and have a market for these foods, and building that system, I think, is an important part of it. In terms of research needs, as Sarah mentioned, comparisons by protein base are important. Looking at the relative bioavailability of both protein and micronutrients, understanding longer term things, and also how plant-based meat works in that context of supporting adherence and supporting actual change. Looking at different populations, looking at longer term longer term studies and studies in specific dietary groups, and also research. So we do have, in terms of the regulatory approvals, there's quite a lot of data on the actual kind of makeup of cultivated meat, but we need a lot more to kind of understand exactly what nutritional opportunities and challenges might come up as that field matures.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you, Amy. I'm going to pass over to Rob now, and then we're going to have a discussion.
Thanks, Tara. Hi, everyone. My name is Rob Percival. I'm Head of Food Policy at the Soil Association, and I'm the author of a book called The Meat Paradox, which touches on some of these questions as well. And I guess worth saying up front that where I'm coming into this conversation from, my background is not in nutrition or the technical side of alternative proteins, but in food systems and how they relate to health. So it's the food systems perspective that I'm bringing to this. And there's a particular food future, or the broad a broad food future that I'm invested in as well. Broadly speaking, a future informed by the values and vision of the agroecology movement. The Soil Association, we're working to bring about a transition to agroecology, which means, in addition to the adoption of low input, diverse, nature-friendly farming systems, a whole range of changes across supply chains, society, the redistribution of power and agency in food systems, and the wide-scale adoption of healthy and sustainable diets, which we understand to be predominantly based around minimally processed foods and rich in plants in particular. And key to all this is a rapid phase out of industrial livestock production, both for the sake of animals and the environment. And there's a very interesting question, we think, as to the role that alternative proteins play in this context. Can they help bring about this agroecological transition, or are they potentially a hindrance to it? In what contexts can they help contribute towards this vision, and where might they pose barriers? So those are the questions that, broadly speaking, I'm interested in. And in relation to health, I think it's worth saying that there are three different levels on which we can approach this conversation, or three different lenses that we can adopt. Firstly, on a product level, whether we can ask whether alternative proteins are healthy and more or less nutritious than the products they're replacing or designed to replace. And I think we'll be talking about that quite a lot more to come. But also on a dietary level, it's worth asking what types of dietary preferences and patterns these products might encourage and typify, and the question as to whether these are healthy. So are these products likely to shift the overall balance of the diet, or could they help entrench unhealthy dietary preferences? And then taking a step back even further, it's worth asking what types of food system alternative proteins are characteristic of, or might be characteristic of, and how these systems might influence health outcomes. And these are all big, complicated questions, and they're made even more challenging by the fact that there's limited research on some of these products, some of these technologies, some of these proteins. We don't necessarily know the answers. Plant-based, obviously more studied than cultivated meat, and precision fermentation producing quite a diverse range of ingredients or foods, all of which need to be considered. Now, diversity is going to be a challenge for this conversation as a whole, I think, because alternative proteins are not one single thing. They're lots of different things. And of course, the answer to all this is, or the answer to these questions is highly context dependent. So we need to specify the context in which we're approaching these questions as well. And finally, I just wanted to share, there's a lot of writing here, but just share this paper that I was recently involved in, which was led by Kate Sievert out of Deakin University, which sought to position ultra-processed foods and industrial livestock as two sides of the same food system coin. So saying there's a similar or a shared underlying sort of food system drivers, an underlying logic that is giving rise to both ultra-processed foods and industrial meat. And obviously, alternative proteins cut across this conversation in quite an interesting way. They straddle both debates, both agendas. And we don't talk about alternative proteins much in the paper, but we do suggest, or we do ask whether they might be considered in similar terms as manifestations of the same underlying logic, which is not to conflate the differences between them, but it is true to say that they are emerging in a particular context as a manifestation of a highly corporatized and financialized food system with the same opaque investors in the background, even sometimes big industrial meat companies, as we know, investing in these technologies. So this poses the question as to, I think, the degree to which they pose a disruptive potential in the context of current food system dynamics. And it poses some interesting questions as to whether they will ultimately help deliver a healthier diet, or they might help, or whether alternatively they might entrench us in the status quo. But anyway, there's lots to unpick on that front, but I'll stop there.
Thank you, Rob. So those three presentations were really, really helpful. And I think there's lots of directions we could go in. I think one of the directions that would be useful to look at is the question of ultra-processed foods. And firstly, in a way, Amy, you suggested that framing was unhelpful. Rob, you were suggesting that the kind of underlying logic might be similar. So it may be that your kind of definitions of ultra processed and what's included in that baggage, and I guess what counts as health, might be slightly different, or at least sort of subsections of each other. So I mean, I think, Amy, I mean, you made the initial comment. Do you want to just elaborate a little bit?
Yes, of course. So I think this is a really interesting topic, and I think it's actually I think also one of the problems with it is just that everything is so complicated. It's really important when we're talking about such huge, complicated things to kind of drill down into specifics for the actual kind of overview. So in terms of, so I completely agree with Rob's characterization of those different framings. So on the nutritional side of things, as we've seen, broadly speaking, the nutritional profile is pretty good for these plant-based meats. So if when we look at the studies on ultra-processed foods, generally how they work is they will take population level data over long periods of time. They will give people questionnaires to look at what they're eating and then follow them. So typically those food frequency questionnaires were taken so the UK Biobank, I think it goes up to kind of the early 2010s. And so that data, all of that intake data is from before plant-based meat as it currently exists kind of was there. And then there were a few products like corn, for instance, was around then, but the food questionnaires used in those studies didn't distinguish between plant-based alternatives and stuff like tofu. So those studies really, and given the fact that most of the UPF category is stuff like sugary drinks, processed meat, stuff that we know is very bad for you, I think it is important to bear in mind and think about like how applicable is this research. And we do know when we look at randomized controlled trials that do specifically look at plant-based meat, they find very different outcomes to those looking at the UPF group as a whole. So I think to begin with, on that kind of nutritional level, I think it's quite important to kind of keep that in mind, that those top population level studies don't really apply that well. And then to the second point of the kind of dietary patterns, we also know that oftentimes the people who, so you can actually look in some of the supplementary materials of some of those UPF studies, and there's more on this in the UPF guide that I recently pulled together alongside the Physicians Association of Nutrition. But a lot of the people eating those plant-based, the plant-based meat alternatives and the tofu, because it's all quite old data, but those people usually also eat more whole plant foods. Broadly speaking, it is not the same group of people who is eating, the people who most plant-based meat are not the same people who are generally eating the most UPF as a whole. And so I think, again, it doesn't necessarily translate to being kind of directly relevant. I think obviously some of the concerns are still relevant, and that
can I push you on that, Amy? Just that I think what you're saying, if I understand you, that the old plant-based is different from this new plant-based, given these new emerging foods, and therefore, but I think you also pointed out that people who eat, I think it was you, pointed out that the people who eat these alternative proteins are also omnivorous and are eating a range of other foods. So they may not necessarily be those more health conscious people anyway. So how does that kind of fit into your set of distinctions?
So I think the important thing is actually like that group of people who currently don't eat many of them are the group of people who there is the most scope for them to improve the lifestyle of, because obviously everybody has different preferences and choices, and there are some people who really enjoy eating healthily, there are some people who find it harder, and I think just providing that wider range of options based on the volume sales data we know so far, it seems likely that plant-based alternatives, and as we can improve them with fermentation made and cultivated ingredients, are more likely to be able to kind of meet the needs of some of those people who it's maybe harder to kind of reach with the beans. But presently it doesn't seem like, it seems more there's not kind of concrete data because it's quite hard to get good data on this, but it seems more likely that these foods are kind of helping to expand the number of plant-based foods. It's not just people are like, okay, well, I'll replace this for that and then stop.
And on the wider framings that Rob was talking about, I mean, Amy or Sarah, perhaps you might want to come in on that. And I also wanted to feed in the point made about the kind of the urgency of the climate problem. And so to you, Rob, I guess the question of, is the best, as you define it, the enemy of the good when it comes to the moral hazard or the structural lock-in of going in one direction rather than trying to be more systemic. But on the other hand, if you don't do anything, we will be where we are. So anyone pile in on this question? Sarah, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I think so it's quite interesting because I'm just going to post in the chat. We conducted a study very recently because as Amy mentioned, usually the studies are following up people that have changed before plant-based have been in the market. But I just posted this study in the chat that sort of like goes very nice along with the lines of like the climate emergency, because we observed from supermarket data. So we're actually looking into data from 2012 to 2018. We looked into how people are purchasing their different foods, and we tried to identify a group of champions, and these are people that have actually managed to reduce their carbon footprint. And within this study, we identified two dietary patterns, or like two clusters of people. And the interesting thing is, despite the differences between the two groups, the reason in common why their footprint went down was because there were meat reductions. But the interesting thing about these two groups is that the one group, they actually did go through these healthier sort of dietary patterns. So they were eating more fruits and vegetables and some healthier items, including some plant-based alternatives. But then we have this other group that we observed that they were not necessarily following a healthier dietary sort of diet, and basically is a bit of a challenge because this highlights and shows that some people maybe are trying to reduce their meat, or they're, it just happened that they reduce their meat, but they don't know how to do it. And when we think about the ultra processing side, particularly in many high-income countries where most of the people are consuming ultra-processed foods because of convenience, timing, there's so many different aspects why people can actually not consume whole foods. They are consuming processed meats. And by people swapping into the plant-based alternatives, these actually means is a healthier alternative because we're comparing ultra-processed for ultra-processed. And I think this is something that is often forgotten in the discussion because we sort of put the meat as like the holy meat, I guess, that is like very, very healthy and more thinking of like a lean cut of meat. And I think that's where the nuances need to be discussed, because if the plant-based alternative can shift that processed meat product, then we're actually gaining a lot more, especially for those individuals that need to shift.
Rob, do you have any reflections on that? Because what Sarah's really talking about is the urgency
Yeah.
and the starting points.
So I think on ultra processed and Nova, the single clearest, least controversial conclusion you can draw from Nova-based science is that healthy diets, or diets that are minimally processed and rich in plants are good for health. That's what is coming through. That's what the dietary guidelines in Brazil promote. That's what the World Health Organization promotes as a healthy diet. But if you take a step back, Nova-informed analysis of food system dynamics is also revealing why those diets are so hard to access for so many people, and why there's this global dietary transition towards ultra-processed foods and industrial livestock, which is being driven by a set of commercial forces, corporatization, financialization, and so on. So you can, I think, position alternative proteins within this picture as undoubtedly the better choice compared to industrial meat. I would encourage anyone to choose a plant-based nugget over a factory farm chicken nugget without a moment's hesitation. But similarly, the question can be posed as to whether they really disrupt that underlying logic, and if the urgency is radical transformational change across the food system, are these products in any way going to contribute to that? I think that's an open question. It's not one I don't pose that question to dismiss them out of hand, alternative proteins, but I think it remains to be seen whether they can significantly disrupt that underlying set of drivers which are fueling the climate crisis.
I don't know who went first, Amy or Sarah. Amy, why don't you?
Yeah. So yeah, I think obviously like that. I think, and to be honest, this is why I think that alternative proteins are so exciting. I don't see how we achieve that level of change and that rapid speed of transition without that mechanism, like that theory of change and that mechanism of people having something so that they can meet those needs. And I think the other thing I would say is that while there is a lot of observational research on Nova, there are actually government publicly funded investigations in the UK, in Germany, in France, in Spain, in Italy, who have all reached similar conclusions, and the Nordic Council, sorry, have all reached similar conclusions that it is not necessarily helpful to look at Nova without also the context of nutritional profile. And so I think bearing that in mind is useful. Like, it can be a really useful framework for people to kind of help identify where they can like eat more fruit and vegetables and loads of it, make those positive changes. But I do think as well, we do need to be mindful of just how much we still don't really know as to what the mechanism of processing is and how it's likely that different, what we know very, very well that different processing steps have different impacts on health. Like, you boil an egg, it can increase its digestibility. You boil vegetables, it can leach the vitamins out of them. It's really not a very homogeneous landscape at all. And I think talking in too broader terms, particularly given how different alternative proteins are from the average UPF, it's an important kind of, it's always worth digging into like the specifics on those things.
Thank you. Sarah?
Yeah, I think just adding on to Rob's comment on the radical shifts, I fully agree with what Rob mentioned, but I think like a way that I see it, like a way forward given the urgency, like I think that's the one thing that is like stuck in my head. I feel like we will always have the aspects that we will not know enough, but I think most of the evidence coming through is showing positive outcomes, and that doesn't mean we're going to stop and then we're just going to tell people that they actually have to replace their animal products completely for these products. But I think where the conversation needs to be more open is that while we start recommending certain products, and I think it needs to be a very careful selection of which ones are those specific products that people can actually consume on a more regular basis, I think we still need to continue more studies trying to understand the behavioral component on how we actually increase the consumption of fruits and vegetables and legumes and like the more sort of like whole food side. But I think we sort of like reached a point where, because there's so many unknowns, but there's also some evidence, the more unknowns are leading the conversation. And this is where like the ultra processed foods aspects come through, like food safety issues. And I think we kind of like forget that we are in like an urgent sort of, we really need to figure out how to shift diets quickly. So this is why I do think like they can help us in a way. And in the meantime, we can keep on exploring which are the best ways and which products we probably shouldn't be consuming. And perhaps down the line, we will find that some of those products are actually not healthy or there's some issues. But at least in a way, I feel like we will help people shift. And hopefully there is a tendency that people will shift to these alternatives and eventually be more open to consume more whole foods. I think once you sort of like remove that food item that you're used to in your plate, I think you become a little bit more open to explore other options.
So just to kind of develop this a bit more, what I'm really interested in doing with this conversation is to see where there can be points of commonality. I mean, there's obviously the headline point of commonality is that everyone is desperately worried about climate change and aware that we have a health crisis on our hands. But in terms of kind of where you might be able to agree a little bit more, Amy, you mentioned alternative grains. I'm assuming you mean feedstock ingredients into the fermentation process. Was that correct?
Yeah, so there's kind of a mix. So firstly, I think it's important to bear in mind that a lot of the, particularly like the soy and the protein crops that we grow, that we eat as humans, a lot of those are very similar to the ones that we grow to feed animals, and broadly we feed a lot more of them to animals, and they've been optimized for that. So there's actually quite a lot of scope, and there's been quite a lot of interesting research, particularly in the global south as well, for identifying local crops like sorghum and millet that have some really good nutritional profiles, but how we can like utilize those and find kind of local resilient crops that we can be making into these things, and maybe using some of the things we've learned about plant-based like novel plant-based foods to kind of improve their bioavailability, reduce anti-nutrients and things like that. So there's that sort of things. And then there's also, as you mentioned, like how to use like different things for feedstocks, but also for things to eat. So koji, which is the kind of the fungi that is used to make tempeh. There's some really interesting research going on in Germany on how to make that into kind of a base protein for cheeses and things like that. So I think there's actually quite a lot of things that aren't particularly new foods that we can just sort of use and leverage differently with a little bit more kind of public funding and focus on what we can do with what we have, and a bit more focus on using different, like moving away and diversifying where we're getting those ingredients from.
Robert, I mean, what do you think about that? I mean, I'm just the idea of perhaps supporting the expansion and growth of a wider range of plant sources. I mean, I guess you can look at it from two ways: as exploitation of indigenous crops or trying to grow the market. But I mean, how do you see this?
So I think obviously diversifying crop production, a good thing. Yes, diversifying the foods that we're consuming is likely to be good for health. I think there are lots of ways you could deliver that don't involve highly processed meat imitation products. So again, my feeling is that there's a niche for this, and there's no, from my perspective, no reason to oppose this innovation or research in this space. But it wouldn't strike me as the priority for improving dietary health or transforming agricultural systems. There's a sense in which this might seem a little peripheral compared to other actions that the governments or food system stakeholders could be taking. But sure, there is an area of agreement there. I don't disagree with anything Amy just said.
But it's the relative balance of energy, resources, and intellectual oomph that you're concerned about.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
I mean, one of the things we haven't discussed, but is that, I mean, you know, we've talked about alternative proteins somehow, which is a little bit narrow, because there are also alternative fats that might be worth looking at. So again, this is the question of some substitute for palm oil, which of course is intrinsic to a highly industrialized system, but at the same time, there's a lot of environmental disaster that is arising as a result of it. So Rob, where might you see substitutes for that? And then connected to that as another area is oceans and alternatives to fish, particularly with the whole well, I think the omega-3s is a whole other discussion about their nutritional role or otherwise. Can we talk a bit about fish and palm oil substitutes?
I'm very happy to go first, and then yeah. So I think this is also it's also worth noting. Precision fermentation is kind of what people have started using for these novel things, but it is a process that's been used for a long time. So most of the rennet, for instance, used in cheese made in the UK today uses microbial rennet, which is made using precision fermentation, which kind of emulates the enzyme chymosin, which is in calf stomachs, which is kind of limited in production. So it's just been easier to make it with microbial production. So we do already have in a lot of our food systems, and also in not necessarily, like, people don't usually consider cheese to be UPF, or like a lot of cheese that will use this. So I think it's important to bear in mind that this isn't necessarily as new as it can sometimes seem, and these ingredients kind of vary. But I think, yeah, absolutely, as you say, Tara, approaches to replacing palm oil, I think coffee as well, and chocolate and things like that are other compounds that have been of interest to a lot of researchers, and have a lot of promise. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of scope for quite a wide variety of foods, and we don't just need to be thinking about kind of meat alternatives, but more how can we kind of safeguard and kind of shore up the stocks. I think bird flu impacting egg prices in the US is a good recent example. Like, having a precision fermentation pathway for providing that egg protein that is used in so many foods could be a very good way of kind of making the stability and keeping food prices more stable.
Rob, any reflections? Sarah?
Do you, Sarah? Oh no,
I'm happy to jump in. Yeah. I think, like, on the fish side, I find that is probably like the most difficult and challenging conversation, because I think most of the research is constantly comparing like meat versus plant-based or like novel alternatives of other sorts. But I think fish is quite complicated, and we've done some studies on food-based dietary guidelines where we had discussions with different people that have been in charge of updating their food-based dietary guidelines. And we saw that usually on the discussion on fish, the health side always beats the environmental sort of like component. But at the same time, I think even though we are aware of the challenges regarding like fish stocks, we also observe that because the health component is much bigger, is much more challenging from the health perspective to give in on the fish side. So I think we need a lot more studies to first understand from the fish stock side and the aquaculture point of stand what it means to produce these foods this way. And there is a lot of challenges from the aquaculture side, like using lots of like antibiotics and just destroying certain like environments for the way in which you produce the animals, and there's lots of diseases. So like there's lots of other challenges for those people that were sort of like trying to shift towards aquaculture products. So yeah,
sorry, can you clarify? Is what you're saying that the existing aquatic sector is full of problems around antibiotics use and all the rest of it, or are you saying that the development of the alternatives itself has problems around antibiotics use?
Yeah, sorry. So the production of aquaculture products, due to the production of fish that are like in such tight spaces, there is the proliferation of more diseases, and therefore there is an excess use of antibiotics. But at the same time, we don't have those comparisons of those alternatives to fish and how much better they are in comparison to fish. So I think we definitely need a lot more to explore in this area. And I do think it would be like very interesting to see what actually happens with cultured fish, if potentially is the same type of product. Yeah, it would be very interesting if it has the same health outcomes.
Rob?
So I'm interested in who's investing in these technologies and why. And I think in cultivated seafood, there's a range of investors, but it includes some of the same guys who are investing in industrial seafood. Some of the big companies, Nomad Foods, who are also associated with Bird's Eye, are investing. And there are real legitimate challenges with aquaculture and wild sea fishing, which need to be addressed very urgently. But I guess again, there's a question as to how these technologies are going to scale, who's going to own the IP, to what degree they will, within that market context, displace existing products, and where the power in all this again sits. And they're really thorny questions. Yeah, the huge potential for good, but also the risk that the underlying dynamics remain unchanged.
So Rob, if the concern is with the concentration of power in the food system by corporations, then I guess the obvious answer to that is more state support for open access technological development of the kind that New Harvest, who we heard in the first webinar, was talking about. So what do you think about that approach? If power is the real issue?
I don't know if power is the real issue. I think plausibly power is the real issue. And I think, yeah, open source approaches are obviously going to be preferable. I think a lot of the solutions to this have been sort of mapped out. They're really complex to implement, but stronger antitrust laws and more democratic food governance spaces, greater regulation, all the things that that have been voiced for many years around industrial meat and ultra-processed foods can helpfully be brought to bear in the conversation around how alternative proteins scale and what type of future they have. But it's really tricky delivering all of that, obviously.
Yeah. I was also sorry, Amy, can I just jump in? And it goes back to being a question both for you in response to your last comment and a comment from Rob. You were talking about coffee, and of course, yes, we have lots of problems with coffee production, but it is also a livelihood for innumerable people around the world, and the very, very poorest people. So as you point out, these technologies are very, very long way off, but how do you all see the potential impact on smallholder farmers, and how and if and whether that can be addressed, even while alternatives develop?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good question. And also kind of as you spoke to there, why public funding and public support for this kind of thing is so important. So how I see it is, I think broadly alternative proteins can make a lot more space for kind of less and better. So ideally it will be replacing the processed meat that's often being made with sort of intensive animal farming, and it can, in terms of coffee, it can hopefully support making more space for kind of higher welfare, higher working conditions, making sure that production is, there's more kind of space and there's more room to kind of properly pay for that. And so I think that needs a lot of work to make sure that that's actually how it works, and that's why public investment is so necessary. I think it's really interesting as well looking at the ecosystem. So I feel very lucky to be working in Europe because we have so much more government support and so much more investment that we see. So Denmark has made really, really cool investments in the whole ecosystem of plant-based production. So all the way from the crops to how you make the plant-based alternatives, whole foods, processed foods, all these different things. And I think that kind of model is really important to making sure that we do see that. I think also public-private partnerships have been something that we've been seeing a lot in Europe. There are examples in Sweden, in Belgium, and in the UK, whereby there's open access infrastructure and also partnerships between both sort of industry and kind of government and university researchers to try and help make sure that research can lead to a diverse ecosystem of kind of smaller and larger companies, and it's not just all concentrating in one place. But I think it's really essential that we do have that public funding to achieve that. I think it's also worth noting that China has recently announced some significant investments to expand the research into cultivated meat and that kind of thing. So that we are seeing, it's not just in Europe, we are seeing other countries recognizing the potential of this, and also having public investment be involved.
Who was else? Was that you, Sarah, who was about to come in?
Yeah, I think just to add on what Amy said, I think we need like these clear policies as well that like just help like those smallholder farmers or like those farmers producers of like livestock, so that they can actually transition towards like a perhaps different type of job if this is like the shift that we're going towards. But I think taking into consideration production of like coffee or cacao, and I think probably that also extends to like palm oil. I think we always think of like taking away those jobs from like the smallholder farmers, but I think those smallholder farmers are already really suffering in the system, because I think it comes again to what Rob said on like the big corporates are the ones that are pretty much managing most of the different crops or livestock products that we consume. So I think it could perhaps be a really nice opportunity to actually make a shift into the system to include those smallholder farmers, to just be more inclusive and actually help them to be more productive and actually have a better livelihood. I think because I come from Ecuador and living in the UK, I can see how like the UK has quickly shifted from consuming tea on a regular basis. You see everybody always with a cup of coffee. And I'm always quite shocked because like I don't assume that the majority of people are actually buying their coffee from these smallholder farmers. And it's not their fault, because this is also like a problem from the system, and usually because of the price. And with the impacts of climate change, these are also going to become more difficult to produce. So I think altogether, we just actually need to think that the production is going to change as well. And how are we going to cope with that level of consumption that we have in most European countries or other high-income countries?
Rob, do you have any thoughts on that?
Just that as has been said, these technologies could be hugely disruptive and could deliver benefits or challenges to smallholder farmers and those in the global south and so on. And the priority for me is that these technologies are delivered in a democratic context, so that people have these farmers have the right to choose their engagement with them, and in a national context there's a proper democratic process governing their regulation and so on. Because we've already seen that there are bits of the alternative protein industry who are talking about expansion into the global south, and there will be ramifications there which need to be carefully managed if it's not to be a sort of neo-colonial enterprise.
So I'm going to turn to questions in a moment, but there's one comment that one question I have that we haven't yet touched upon, but which I think is very, very strong, at least in sort of public sentiment in relation to the goodness and badness and the healthfulness of foods. And that's the question of naturalness. There is often an equation of naturalness with goodness, just whatever people actually eat, there is the idea that if it's natural, it's going to be better for you. And so I suppose my question is, what is your relationship with the idea of naturalness as a guide to anything at all, really? And I'm going to start with you, Rob, because this is your bread and butter.
I think we need to treat naturalness with a high degree of caution. I think there's good empirical evidence that diets based around whole foods are good for health, and that some of those benefits derive from the fact that these foods are produced in nature. They're complex in ways that you can't replicate in a manufacturing process. So there is a degree to which proximity to nature is a relevant factor in the sort of healthfulness of those foods. And more broadly, within the agroecology and organic movements, there's a sense in which you're trying to learn from and build on natural processes in developing a farming system, an approach to farming, and even a sort of social system beyond that. So there's something there, but it's a bit more complex and nuanced than natural equals good, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Amy, Sarah, any thoughts?
I'm going to make a very simplistic thought, but I think before working on the novel alternatives, I was a bit of this type of person that was quite anti-ultra processed foods. And I think it was a very interesting journey researching these products and seeing the difference. But whenever I think of naturalness, I always think of one of my ex-bosses when I used to work in the food safety team in the Food and Agriculture Organization, that he always used to mention that water is very important for all of us. But if you drink more than 8 liters of water in one go, it would actually kill you. So I think it's like a really nice, it always stuck in my head because it's a really nice analog, I guess, to remind us that just because it's synthetic, it doesn't mean it's bad for us. You just have to be cautious about how you're consuming it.
Thank you. And Amy?
Yeah, so yeah, I think this is a really interesting thing. And I think it's also something that a lot of people, particularly when I was doing the research for the UPF guide, I was actually really surprised by how much kind of less processed in some instances, some of the ways that they're made are. So for instance, like protein concentrates, which are actually quite common, it's kind of grinding soy flour, centrifuging it to separate out by weight, and the heavier ones are generally have lower protein, and so then you use that as the concentrate. So that still has a lot of that underlying, as a base ingredient, it still has a lot of the underlying good stuff in beans in, and we need more research to understand how much. But I think it's quite easy to assume that things don't have some of that natural stuff in them just because they kind of look different. But if you think about, so like bread, obviously doesn't look like its original stuff. Pasta, often shaped pasta is made using extrusion in and the plant-based meat is often also used making those methods. So I think while it's good to think about in those, I think it can be kind of quite comforting to people. It's always useful to think about like how much of this is an assumption that I'm making about how natural something is and how much of it is kind of real. I think the other thing I would say, so I do a lot of sports, and I have always, just even before I was involved in GFI or anything like that, I always really like plant-based meat just because it's kind of got a lot more kind of protein and fiber per 100 grams than beans, so it can be quite useful in terms of not having to eat just a massive bowl of beans. There can be instances where it can be useful. Obviously, it's all like lots of different considerations, and I think naturalness can oversimplify things.
Thank you. And we haven't even touched upon the question of fortification and whether, you know, calcium in in your soy milk, in your fortified soy milk is equivalent to the calcium that occurs naturally in foods. And I mean, because we need to move on to the questions like that, for me, that's a really interesting question. Do we know enough here?
I would say we need a lot of research. We do have some knowledge. So there is particularly in terms of the protein bioavailability, because this is a relevant consideration in anti-hunger programs. But we do know that certain the processing methods used can reduce anti-nutritional factors and improve the bioavailability of protein. We do also know that that can also be relevant for kind of iron and things, but there are known bioavailability challenges with whole plant foods. Some of them are almost certainly going to be also the case. Some of them are reduced. I think it's also worth thinking about like the different protein sources here. So mycoprotein is made from fungi, so it doesn't tend to have the same anti-nutritional factors as some plants. And so thinking about what those ingredients are, again, that specificity is going to be important. But I think, in short, yes, very important to have much more research into how that bioavailability is affected, and also just consistency in that micronutrient profile, I think, is one of the main areas to improve.
Sarah, did your research dig into that at all?
Yeah, so we looked into the fortification aspect, and we did notice, as I mentioned in the short presentation, that it is quite variable. So not all products are fortified. And another challenge to this aspect is that if you, for example, would choose an organic product, these cannot actually be fortified because then it cannot be called organic. So this brings a lot of layers depending on the type of diet that you consume, if you should actually be consuming a product that is fortified or not. So like the general recommendation is choose a product that is fortified. But if you're also following a more flexible diet where people are consuming meat and dairy and just other animal products, then that fortification aspect is not so important. But I think just adding on to what Amy mentioned, I think while we do need more studies on the bioavailability aspect, I think it's also important to learn from other sort of studies and country examples, like fortification of salt with iodine, for example, has been very successful in lots of different countries, or fortification of calcium in other Nordic countries. So I think there's plenty of examples that show us that fortifying foods is the way to help the general population to reach those micronutrients. So I think we have to learn from these other food categories for these products.
Thank you. Right. I'm going to belatedly move on to the questions, and we have one from Samantha Lau, who says, "Hi, thank you for this series. I'm in the United States, and currently there are 7 states that have banned lab-grown meat. The meat industry has lobbied Republican states to adopt these policies to stop all protein products from going to market there, and they're going to continue with as many states as possible. What can we do to combat this sort of tactic from the most powerful industry?" And I think we're all aware that the livestock sector have pulled and pushed debates around about plant-based eating in general in all sorts of directions. Rob, do you have any, can I start with you on this kind of equation of some banning? We're also seeing it in Europe, in Italy.
Yeah, it's quite perverse, isn't it? And quite surprising seeing it in America, I guess, and in particular, given the emphasis on free markets and consumer choice and so on that arises in that context. And in Europe, it's the sort of pushback against alternative proteins and so on has often been done in the name of, you know, traditional meat, even though we know that most of the meat people consume is industrially farmed and very, very problematic in various respects. So I don't know what the answer is, except to double down on public messaging around the harms of industrial livestock and forge alliances to stand against the industry when it tries to wield its power in these ways. And I think it's that's the space we should be focused on, the true villain of the piece, as opposed to sort of what the problems may be with alternative proteins and so on.
I mean, you've made some very strong comments about the importance of democratic sort of and proper regulations and the kind of the disrupting the power concentration. But so do you see that there could be a way in which, and you've also talked about the kind of complexity of these issues, which maybe this is a leading question. Do you see that some involvement of, let's say, the Soil Association in alternative proteins as a way of countering that sort of right-wing ideological messaging? Could you ever see a future where because of your focus on justice and so forth, that you could see your position softening within the Soil Association? I'm not being very articulate here.
It's a big question, and I think our position is fairly soft. We're pragmatists, and we're when asked about this, I usually rabbit on about how bad industrial meat is and how most of the meat we consume is ultra processed, and that's where the focus should be. I think we're pragmatically ambivalent about the role alternative proteins might play in an agroecological transition, and some folks, Dustin at Green Alliance, you'll be aware, has been much more positive and enthusing about the sort of alliance that could be forged there between the old protein industry and the agroecology movement. So I think we're our eyes are on the prize, which is the end result. And if alternative proteins help us get there, then great. But some reason for questioning whether that will be the case.
I love the phrase pragmatically ambivalent. It's a good one. Okay, Sarah, do you have any thoughts here?
No, I think I fully agree with Rob. I think as much as we see like what the science says, I think it is good to question it. But I do believe we don't have so much time to question it. So like I think we do have to make like quite direct decisions. And to be fair, I think it is quite concerning the fact that the US is taking this turn. And I think the only way to sort of like fight against these sort of like political sphere that we're like living on, I think, is just trying to be more aware of like the science and trying to follow the right channels where you actually get informed. And like if you're somebody that are informed, to actually try to share more of that with just regular people that you know, so that people can actually have the access to the right information.
Thank you. Amy, any other thoughts? You don't have to if you feel it's been said.
Yeah, I agree with everyone else.
Okay, I've got a question here. Oh, wait a minute, I've lost it now. I'm so sorry. An anonymous attendee says, it's such a new topic and seems like the language is evolving. I'm interested whether framing and dialogues may influence mindsets and wonder, might calling some foods alternative protein, are we suggesting regular balanced plant-based diets aren't adequate in protein or aren't adequate per se? Whereas as Amy mentioned, when people are short of is fiber. I'm also not sure insects are an alternative to meat. So I think the main thrust of this question is in the framings of the word of the phrase alternative proteins. Are we reinforcing an unwarranted panic about our protein intakes?
I'm happy to kind of maybe speak to the start of this, and then I think everyone else will have interesting things to say as well. But I think so. I think we broadly in GFI Europe, we tend to try and talk more about protein diversification, like this idea that we're currently quite over-reliant on animal based foods and trying to kind of increase the variety of different foods that we can use to meet those nutritional needs. I think there is definitely very clearly lots of people are very, very focused on protein at the moment, which is maybe sort of beyond the bounds of what is justified on the available evidence. But I do think it's also important to bear in mind that there are some subgroups of people who do have more specific protein needs. So athletes, I think, are a big one, but also older people tend to need a bit more protein. So I think it is very important to bear in mind that there's lots of different kind of things. I think in terms of the question of is a balanced plant-based diet inadequate? I would say absolutely not, but lots of people really struggle to follow them. So it's more finding lots of different ways that meet people where they're at in terms of their diets, to try and kind of find lots of different ways to address the same problem in the hope that that will support more people to improve the quality and sustainability of what they eat.
Thanks. There's also a question from Alexia Miller, and I'm not sure if anyone can answer this, but she writes, when foods are fortified with synthetic vitamins and minerals in order to meet nutrient requirements, are we considering the environmental impacts of how these synthetic vitamins and minerals are synthesized industrially, i.e. when they are fortified using petrochemicals and shipped across the world? Anyone on the environmental impacts of, I would suspect it's minimal compared to the overall.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump on that one, but yeah, I think in most studies, I think that there is probably some studies that are missing out in actually calculating the environmental impact of these fortified nutrients. But it is the big picture, which is like animal products, which are particularly ruminants, are the ones that produce the most carbon, and that's what we need to reduce. So it's such a tiny proportion that it wouldn't really make such a huge difference if we're like considering or not, if they're fortified or not. And I think here is where we need to think about the benefits of fortifying these products is actually to avoid a lot of other issues that we would have in the system if people are becoming deficient in certain micronutrients. So I hope this answers a bit of the question.
Thank you. Oh, Amy.
One just small thing I think is something I found interesting again with the research in the UPF guide is also that I think a lot of people don't realize that there's also quite a lot of fortification that does go into animal feed, particularly in terms of just for animal health, but also it does end up in the end product. So iodine, for instance, is a lot of that in cow's milk and dairy products comes from fortification. B12 in non-ruminant animals generally comes from the fortification in the feed because it's made by bacteria. So I think it's important to bear in mind that while like the point at which the fortification added is different, there is often also fortification across the line. And I also think it's important to bear in mind that there's not always that much, that there can be variability in the content of animal-based foods in some of these nutrients. So iodine, there was a recent report that there's kind of variation. So I think we need to be paying attention to that in both animal and plant-based things, but particularly plant-based probably.
Thank you. That's very, very interesting. Rob, is fortification of feedstuffs permitted under inorganically certified systems?
Good question. Probably a few ingredients, but not the full spectrum that you get in industrial livestock. I'd have to check the technical detail of the standards, but it's probably limited, I expect.
Okay, thanks. Just I have a question which is about food security. So Amy, you talked about food security and how these foods can help provide a bulwark against floods and droughts and whatever might happen that might affect livestock more. I'd like to kind of, we're talking about health, but Rob has very explicitly tried to broaden ideas about what we mean by health beyond the kind of the individual nutrients I put in my body, or even beyond the kind of the diets that we consume, towards something a bit bigger. And how do you imagine that these proteins, these foods, can contribute to food security? And Rob, what is your perspective on the kind of underpinnings of what food security is? Maybe we could just kind of draw that out a little bit more. Amy, do you want to elaborate a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, I think this is a really interesting, and this is actually where I think a lot of the focus, this is something that I think is really important, but like, so yeah, it's not just the quantity of animal source foods that get impacted, but also the nutritional quality of them by kind of extreme heat and things like that. It can change the makeup of the soil and things like that. So it's important to be mindful that there can be a bunch of different things, but also, as we mentioned earlier, fish is a really important source of food and really kind of beneficial for health in a lot of contexts, and a lot of people rely on it. But overfishing and use of fish oil in animal feed as well is currently like really placing pressure such that we can't count on necessarily having that supply in future. It's not just that it's unsustainable in terms of like saving the fish, it's we could run out of fish. And so I think in particular kind of algae omega-3s are a very promising kind of approach. That's actually where a lot of the omega-3 that ends up in fish kind of originally comes from, food chain wise. So exploring ways to kind of make those important things without having to rely on these kind of increasingly unstable systems, I think is important, but also, yeah, an area where we need a lot of research focus to try and kind of think through what that might look like, because I think it's still currently not the main area of focus in a lot of projects.
Sarah, Rob, how does your thinking about food security differ?
I think it kind of like goes back to like thinking of diversity and diversifying. I think that's probably like the aspect that I think we need to keep in mind when we're like considering like shifting our food system. And I think I like to go back to that point that I made at the beginning about like pea protein in almost every product. I'm aware that like there's a lot of industrial products that are considering on adding pea protein into bread, into cakes, just because of this sort of like protein obsession. So I think when we're considering these different products as we choose within our diets, it's important that we choose different products. But I think as well in that sort of agenda of like trying to diversify our products, I think is relevant that we not only think of pea protein or soy protein isolates or mycoprotein, like just consider every other different item, and hopefully the industry will be able to produce different forms of proteins that we can actually consume.
Rob?
Yeah, I mean, generally, food security in the space where I sit is conceived in terms of soil health and biodiversity, and getting the ecological underpinnings of food production as healthy and resilient as they can be, which I think still should be the priority. But of these technologies, I think precision fermentation offers the greatest potential sort of add-on to that approach. I guess there's a sense in which it's a proven technology, and the ability to produce proteins and fats could be quite crucial in some contexts, given the impacts that we know are already in the pipeline for farming. Cultivated meat may be unproven at scale. Plant-based, I'm less convinced of its potential in a sort of food security context. But if you could have a distributed sort of production of fermented proteins and fats and so on, then I could see those being a useful addition to the food supply, with all the caveats already voiced. But yeah, I do think there's a potential role in that space.
I mean, going back to, I have to say, I was at a dinner once where some alt proteins investment, and I asked him what he did for a living. He says, "Oh, well, yeah, I've got an alt proteins thing. I'm going to feed Africa," and I said, "Oh, really?" So I just would be interested to know how you see food security in the context of questions around food sovereignty and that question of agency as well. And perhaps you can elaborate a little bit more on that and the kind of white man feeding the world sort of trope.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we should be quite concerned and worried about claims like that. I mean, I think there could be a role for these technologies in diverse national contexts, including in Africa, but I'd be concerned about some sort of mission from the global north to save starving Africans with our clever new proteins. I think that could be very dangerous. So yeah, the food sovereignty framing, I think, is important. I mean, there is a fair amount of skepticism in the food sovereignty movement about the potential of these technologies. They're not well looked upon, generally speaking. That might shift, and there are probably complex reasons for that, which not really mine to speak to. But yeah, there's some interesting tensions, I guess, shaping up between what's technically feasible and what's desirable from the ground.
I don't know who wanted to come in first. Whoever goes first.
Well, yeah, no, just so a quick addition to this. I agree. This is a huge and very important focus, and I think so. We have, as GFI Europe, we have teams in Brazil and India, and they generally lead our work on kind of applications and how to best support food security questions in the global south. But I think, yeah, it's a very important question, and as I see it, the main way of doing that is to kind of support kind of local production and support ways that people can use the crops they already have and try and sort of build those systems themselves, and not to kind of for us to come and do it for them, but to kind of try and see how we can identify and support projects to allow those people to have agency and develop systems that kind of work for them.
Yeah, and I fully agree with what Rob and Amy said. But I think adding on, I think I do feel quite uncomfortable when I hear about like these approaches about using alternative proteins to feed, Africa or Latin America, or just other areas of the world. But I think when I think of food insecurity as well, I also think of like the current price of plant-based alternatives and the potential price that other novel alternatives will have. Because we already see that at the moment, the ones that are consuming these products are sort of like younger people, women, and people with higher socio-demographic backgrounds. And these questions also a lot of issues around the whole food system, because if we see that there is like such a great benefit from one angle, like particularly health or nutritional side, or even the environmental side, how do we actually make it for like those that cannot pay the price? And I think this will be scaled up across like all the other novel alternatives. And I think when we discuss these foods, I think we also need to have this clear distinction between high-income countries, middle-income countries, low-income countries, and within these countries also discussing all the socio-demographic differences across each of these different countries, because it's not that everybody in the global, in high-income countries are actually very rich. We also have a bit of both, and this is the same in other lower and middle income countries.
Thanks. I have a comment from Helen Brewood, who is our speaker at last week's session, who asks, could Rob please expand on his point about foods made by nature being somewhat healthier? Is it about the variety of nutrients that are available in the same food item and how they affect each other's absorption?
So I think my point was that whole foods contain a mix of nutrients, vitamins, minerals, bioactive compounds that can interact with each other to create a greater health impact than if those are isolated and consumed in isolation, if they're synthesized or taken out of the whole foods. I'm not a nutrition scientist, but I think that's a pretty well evidenced claim. There's a lot of work done on the food matrix and so on, and it has to do with, yeah, partly with bioavailability, but also with like a range of other factors, is my understanding. But so if my colleagues might know more, Amy or Sarah.
We'll move on to the next one. It's somebody who's asking, who's concerned about potential health risks of pesticides, especially their carcinogenic effects, also artificial flavors and colors in foods, not just from a nutritional standpoint, but in terms of long-term health impacts. Even with a plant-based diet, notice sodium levels can be quite high. Well, we've covered that, but the questioner asks, have you come across any practical solutions to reduce these risks or make safer food choices? But I'd like to broaden it out really to ask a question about how these foods are produced and made sort of tasty, and the extent to which artificial flavors, colors, flavorings, all that sort of thing is incorporated into them. Yeah, at the product development stage.
Yeah, I'm happy to sort of give a kind of quick initial answer. And this, the answer unfortunately is there is no one answer. There are lots of different things, and there's lots of things being explored. So as I kind of touched on earlier, one of the processes that I'm particularly excited about is the fermentation process that can use kind of new kind of fermentation techniques, but drawing on kind of quite traditional ones to use. It's essentially like minimally processed. It's just sort of mycelium from fungi and oats or soybeans or whatever. So there's lots of, and the approaches to doing that fermentation can have really big impacts on the texture and things like that, and also flavor. So there are instances, and they're currently available, that are that don't have those kinds of ingredients, but also in the ones that do use more processing and more ingredients, there's still a large scale. So there are several products that really don't have that many ingredients in. A lot of them are still pretty tasty and quite popular. I think there's been broadly a lot of people have been more interested in this. There has been kind of a move towards more clean labels. I think there's interesting trade-offs to be had there, but I think it's definitely a case of just different products are different, and there are different approaches that you can pick different items to suit what your preferences are.
Sarah, do you want to add anything to that?
I think just a tiny addition, but I think to clarify that any flavorings or colors or just extra additives that they would be added into the products, they do go through like a food safety check to make sure that they're safe for the population that is consuming it. So I think that's a very important point to highlight. But I think it's quite interesting because we are trying to like convince, I guess, like those people that are consuming the meat products or the dairy products, and they need to be so similar. I think it maybe rounds up to that question again on why is there this constant comparison of one product to the other? Because if we would just think it's a completely different product, then people would make a new idea of it, and then it would just be an addition to it. But because there's this constant comparison, then those producing these products are just trying to imitate and make it like the most similar. And I think that's how many consumers may be disappointed or may be convinced by them.
I mean, I think the simple answer is it goes back to the point that people like meat, and that's the difficult thing. Therefore, they're trying to create the alternative. Otherwise, everyone will be eating, you know,
the same
tofu and broccoli and all the rest of it. So in the last kind of 4 or 5 minutes, I'd be really interested to try and draw this together to see whether you have any reflections on where you feel you've all agreed, where you feel there are points of disagreement, and what research you feel could be done that would help kind of create more commonalities in certain ways. I mean, personally, I feel there's a lot of agreement, but I would be really interested in your thoughts here. Whoever wants to go
I'm happy to start to make it easier, I guess. But I think we fully agree that we need to figure out a way in which we can shift diets. But we are all very concerned on like how these products may be just in the power of the wrong people, I guess. And I think in that food systems transformation, we all agree that we need to consider all the different aspects that we care for, like human livelihood in general. So like being fair to everyone, health for everyone, the environmental component. But I think from my angle, I think from like the alternative plant-based proteins, I think where we really need more research is to start analyzing more analytical samples. At the moment, most of the research is on food labels, and we still need to understand better how these micronutrients interact in our body, the bioavailability issues. And another component, I think, is the behavioral aspect, try to understand what actually helps people shift into these products or just plant-based diets in general. And I think these two aspects should extend to all these other novel alternatives that as they become part of the market, we need to really understand which role they actually play and if people would uptake them or not.
Thank you. Who wants to go next? Amy?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. So I think, yeah, I completely agree with everything Sarah says. And I think, yeah, those areas of kind of nailing down what we do know and expanding that evidence base is really central. And also, I think looking at different like different populations with different nutritional needs is another area, and also different kind of people from different demographic backgrounds is a really important consideration. And likewise, whether those effects that we see are consistent across them. I also think there needs to be a lot of research and kind of thinking about how we can make sure that there's going to be I think looking at how to make sure that those production lines and those procurement chains can kind of shift, where a lot of the crops that we currently grow are going to feed animals. How can we make sure that we're supporting and making it feasible to diversify that, and making sure that there's a kind of pathway to diversification, and making sure that we've kind of thought about and planned through how to make sure that infrastructure and that those supply chains are built. And yeah, and I think in terms of the areas of agreement, I think, yeah, we all just have the same kind of goal, I think. And the main thing is just we can focus on our own areas of specialism and draw on each other's expertise, I think is probably like the most important area for collaboration, because I do think, yeah, there's different people need different solutions. So that collaboration is important.
Thank you. And Rob, last word to you.
I don't have much to add. I agree with the areas of agreements that have been outlined, and I guess the big question that's been posed is, or the question that I've grappled with throughout this, is the degree to which these foods, these technologies represent a genuine pathway towards a radically different future, or where there are pitfalls arising wherein we might become further entrenched in the problematic paradigm that we're stuck in. But it's very much a question as opposed to a dismissal, and as you say, there are broad areas of agreement.
Thank you. Well, that was really interesting. Thank you. Thank you so much, Rob, Amy, and Sarah. In the final few minutes, I just want to say thank the audience for attending, to remind you that we've got a third and final webinar, which is focused on the environmental dimensions, which is going to be on July the 14th, and details on our website. We also have feedback forms, so attendees, we'd be really, really grateful if you could fill those in, because it helps us improve. And do please follow up on all the resource links that's been posted in the chats, including lots of resource links that Amy, Sarah, and Rob have forwarded onto us as useful further reading. So it just remains for me to thank you once again for your really interesting contributions, and to the audience for listening, and to wish you a good evening. Goodbye.